US President Donald Trump has described yesterday's Israeli attack targeting Hamas leaders in the Qatari capital of Doha as a bad situation and said he was very unhappy about it. The Israeli President, Isaac Herzog, is in London today for a bilateral meeting with the British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer.
There was a calm atmosphere in Doha this morning as the Qatari capital returned to something like normality after the dramatic events of yesterday. This was the moment that Israel struck a house where Hamas leaders were meeting to discuss a ceasefire deal. Several were killed, but it's claimed that the Hamas negotiating team survived. On his way to a dinner in Washington, D.C. yesterday, the US President Donald Trump gave his reaction to the assassination attempt.
I'm not thrilled about the whole situation. It's not a good situation. But I will say this, we want the hostages back, but we are not thrilled about the way that went down today.
The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said the strike could open the door to ending the war. However, the US ambassador to Israel was more pessimistic and also criticized the decision of some countries to recognize Palestinian statehood.
It's really had some very harmful effects. The first of which was it ended any conversation that was ongoing with Hamas to try to get the hostages out.
The UK is among several countries expected to recognise the State of Palestine later this month at the UN General Assembly. Earlier today, the British Prime Minister joined other world leaders in condemning Israel's attack in Doha.
I spoke to the Emir of Qatar last night, soon after the attack, to convey our support and solidarity.
Does the UK see a friend of Israel?
This afternoon, the Israeli President Isaac Herzog visited Downing Street. Number 10 said that Keir Starmer would raise what it described as the intolerable situation in Gaza. Meanwhile, Israel struck Houthi sites in Yemen today, the latest in a series of strikes between Israel and Houthi militants. While in Gaza, attacks also continued. The pain and suffering brought about by this war still has no end in sight. Tommy Meskel, RTE News, London.
The European Commission President has delivered her harshest criticism of Israel to date. In her State of the Union speech at the European Parliament, Ursula von der Leyen said the Commission would recommend suspending trade between the EU and Israel and sanctioning extremist Israeli ministers and violent settlers in the West Bank.
President von der Leyen had a torrid summer, facing a confidence motion in July, then a barrage of criticism that Donald Trump had bullied EU negotiators into submission on the trade agreement. Officials have acknowledged a brutal geopolitical context where Europe often struggles to respond quickly to each event. Ms von der Leyen appeared to come out fighting, with a clarion call for Europe to unite and fight for its destiny in a ruthless world.
Europe is in a fight for a continent that is whole and at peace, for a free and independent Europe, a fight for our values and our democracies.
In the wake of Russia's massive drone assaults on Ukraine and the attack on Poland, the president focused on Sasha, a boy abducted by Russian forces in Mariupol, who was told he would have new parents and a new identity in Russia. He was subsequently rescued by his grandmother.
That is what Ukraine is fighting for. And that is what all Europeans deserve. Because Europe is an idea, the idea of freedom and mutual strength.
Then her harshest criticism to date of Israel.
What is happening in Gaza has shaken the conscience of the world. People killed while begging for food. Mothers holding lifeless babies. These images are simply catastrophic. So I want to start with a very clear message. Man-made famine can never be a weapon of war. For the sake of the children, for the sake of humanity, this must stop.
This was a combative speech, but whether she's won over her doubters both among MEPs and with the wider public remains to be seen.
Tony joins us now from Brussels. We're also joined by our Washington correspondent, Sean Whelan. Tony, tough talk from Ursula von der Leyen today about Russia and more unusually about Israel. Will it make any difference to EU policy?
That's a good question, David. Now, she's proposed things like an Eastern flank watch, some talk of a drone wall on the eastern flank, which the Baltic states have been asking for, reparations, loans for Ukraine based on Russian frozen assets. But you're right, I mean, the big talking point is the language on Gaza. Now, it is really, again, going to be up to member states whether they follow through on these proposals. The Commission today saying, yes, there's going to be about 14 million euro in bilateral funding to Israel from the EU that will be suspended. Now, this is low-level issues like twinning programs and so on. During the summer, the Commission did propose suspending Israel's involvement in the Horizon research and science and development programme that's worth several million euro to Israel. Now, that was put to a meeting of EU ambassadors late in July, and again, it didn't get enough support from member states. Germany, Italy, Hungary, all blocking it. Now, the question is whether this idea of partially suspending trade with Israel will run into the same problems. And remember, when we talk about suspending trade, it's not a trade embargo. It's suspending the preferential tariffs that Israel enjoys at the moment as a result of that EU-Israel association agreement, a reduction in checks and controls and so on. Now, the fact that Ursula von der Leyen made such a graphic and impassioned speech is a change in tone, and that could nudge some member states, particularly Berlin, one suspects, to moving closer to a consensus on taking tougher action against Israel. But there's no sign yet this evening that Berlin or any of those other countries are going to go in that direction.
OK, and Sean, President Trump, as we've seen, making disapproving noises both about Israel's attack on Doha and on the Russian drone incursions into Poland. But is there any sign that he's been listened to in either Tel Aviv or in Moscow?
No, there isn't. I mean, clearly there isn't. We've had President Trump, who, if you remember last year's election, was telling us both of those conflicts, which should never have happened if he'd been president, he'd fix it within 24 hours of becoming president. Well, 6 months on, things are getting worse. And we have two US allies, close, important allies, being subject to military operations by the Russians and by the Israelis. Thousands of American troops are stationed in Poland, 10,000 in Qatar, the biggest airbase in the region, just a few kilometres from where those Israeli missiles landed in that Hamas compound yesterday afternoon. The President of the United States looks at serious risk of being humiliated, and also, more importantly, a lot of his signature diplomatic policies are starting to become gravely threatened by the situation, particularly in the Middle East, where the big important thing that he did in his first term, the Abraham Accords, getting a lot of the Arab countries to start the process of normalizing relations with Israel, led by the United Arab Emirates, that now looks in tatters. The Saudis, the Crown Prince there, going to Qatar this week to show solidarity. The Emiratis already there. This threatens an American signature policy there. And in terms of Putin, well, 3 weeks ago he hosted Putin on American soil, gave him that photo up. A week later, he was over in Beijing thumbing his nose at the Americans. Then last week we had the Polish president in town getting an air flyover at the White House from President Trump. Last night, the Russians sent 19 drones into Polish territory. It looks bad for President Trump. His only response so far on social media, what's with Russia violating Poland's airspace with drones? Here we go, exclamation mark. We're waiting for a full statement that he's promised us on the situation in Qatar. Presumably he's going to have to add some additional comments about what's happened in Poland overnight as well. David? OK, well, we'll wait and see. Sean Whelan in Washington, Tony Connolly in Brussels. Thank you for that.
In the past 24 hours, there have been 2 incursions into sovereign nations by Russia and Israel. Just before coming on air, I spoke to Rob Geist-Pinfold, a lecturer in international security who's in Qatar. I began by asking him about the reaction in Doha to the Israeli strike there.
It is definitely furious, Sharon. You can feel that on the ground talking to Qataris. And I think the fury, though, is less directed at Israel and more at the United States. You talk to people here in Doha and they, this is the headquarters, the regional headquarters of CENTCOM, US Central Command. There is a huge US base here and a US presence and thousands of US expats. They really feel like, we did all of these things to get close to the Americans. We didn't hedge our bets with China and Russia. We are clearly a pro-US world power and a major ally in all but name. And when it came to it, you threw us under the bus. We've seen Israel do this a few times recently, crossing red lines. So there's less of a feeling that this is new territory for Israel, though, of course, this is different because we have seen Israel launch what it calls decapitation strikes against Hamas leaders in Gaza, Hezbollah leaders in Lebanon, and indeed the Iranian consulate in Damascus in Syria last year. But this is different because of the status of Qatar, not just as a major US ally, but as you say, as a mediator. And the Israelis had to at least pretend or show that they were taking these negotiations seriously. Now, all bets are off. The Qataris were afforded a degree of protection because of their mediation status, but Israel has finally crossed that red line and struck here. So questions and reverberations, not just in Qatar, but throughout the entire Gulf and indeed the Middle East.
And Rob, what does it mean for the people of Gaza, for the Israeli hostages who are still being held there? Will these negotiations be able to continue? Do they want them to continue?
I think that's not a tenable position for the Qataris anymore. Remember that the Israeli negotiators coming over here were from Israel's security agencies, people like the heads of the Mossad. These are people who will indubitably have played a decision in that strike yesterday in gathering intelligence and possibly even giving the decision to go ahead. So it's not just a case of Israel targeting the opposite side in a mediation, the political bureau and political wing of Hamas, but also it's the people on the other side of the table who are possibly pushing the button. So the Qataris will be in a position where they won't be able to let these talks continue. And as you inferred there, that means that we are very, very far away from a ceasefire in Gaza. We're not likely to see pressure on Israel to end the war. And this makes an invasion and conquest of Gaza City by Israel look much more likely, which will exacerbate humanitarian misery in the Gaza Strip. And as the Israeli army have said in the past, it will endanger the lives of many of those Israeli hostages still being held.
Now, elsewhere, we saw last night Russia pushing the boundaries of its war on Ukraine when drones were shot down over Poland. How significant was that move?
Well, I think it's very significant that it's happening, but also significant that it's happening in tandem with the strikes in Doha. There is a real squeeze on the US now, supposedly as the guarantor of the world order, as the country that's trying to end these conflicts, both in the Middle East and in Europe. This is the first time that Russia has violated the territorial integrity of a NATO member so blatantly. Now, they've denied that that was their intention. They said that they weren't targeting any targets in Poland. But the fact that this happened at all suggests a degree of intent. Enough drones crossed the border. This was not just a rogue drone or two. This was at least 19 drones. And the fact that NATO only managed to shoot down a small number of them will also be ringing alarm bells in many European capitals here, as well as in Washington, D.C. This suggests that despite all of the alarmist rhetoric coming from Moscow, the ongoing and prolonged conflict in Ukraine, NATO and the Polish military simply were not ready for what is not a particularly significant challenge, but a poignant, game-changing challenge.
And of course, US President Donald Trump vowed to end both of those wars. It looks like that's some distance off. Rob, Guys, Penfold, we're out of time. Thanks so much for joining us on 6-1.